So this is a video response to this guy down here. He says at the end of his description that he can't be sure where these ideas he is crapping out come from. And I think that is the perfect place to begin. Because the I or the ego that I know through experience, can never be sure where the ideas that this I has come from. I say I have an idea. I didn't make it up. It came to me. And if it makes sense, it's not because I decided before I spoke it that it was going to be acceptable as a form of reasonable discourse. And I think it's important that whenever we speak of reason, we have to take into account that which is productive of reason, or that which lies beneath reason, or founds reason in the sense of providing its foundation, that which is encompassing reason. And, you could say that we're talking about nature, or we're talking about the unconscious, or we're talking about God. We're talking about that which doesn't appear, but which grounds appearance. And, sometimes reason is spoken of as if it grounds experience. But the more we talk about reason, the more it becomes something other than what was initially meant by the word reason, or the word reality, the word truth, being, essence, goodness, beauty, these types of forms. And I think when you distill them down, and this whole discussion is about Plato and the validity of his heaven, basically, right? His understanding of forms which pre-exist, or at least provide the conditions for the possibility of all the particular instances of sensory experience that we find ourselves engaged in. So for Plato, the idea comes before the appearance. Now, some people now, like Mr. Cropper, an objectivist, or an avid performer of the philosophy of Ayn Rand, or the literary ideology of Ayn Rand, Mr. Cropper would characterize Plato as being someone who doesn't believe in reality, right? Who thinks that there's the ideal world, and then there's the real world, as Cropper calls it, and Plato sides with the ideal world, or the imaginary world, as far as Mr. Cropper is concerned. But Mr. Cropper has defined reality as that which appears. And it's funny because he will rail on and on and on against the kind of postmodern relativism, something he identifies with Kant. He will not just dismiss that, but actively engage in a sort of hate speech against a philosophical event, in the history of human thought, namely the Kantian or the postmodern change, where all of a sudden the object becomes relative to the subject. To sum up what that would mean for Cropper, that is complete insanity. And to some degree, I can't disagree with him. He's criticizing something which needs to be criticized, but his criticism and his construction of this Randian objectivism, this ethical egoism, I think, is too far-fetched. I would call his system an imaginary system that doesn't coincide with reality. But for Cropper, reality is the sensory world, which for Cropper is the objective world. For him, our senses never deceive us. They always speak a truth. And I think there are some caricatures of Plato which would say that he would completely reject experiment and the observation of appearance in order to learn something new about it. And Plato, though, is only falsely caricatured as dismissing that type of experiment, that type of attention paid to experience. I mean, Aristotle, after all, who's championed as an empiricist, and certainly Galileo would in some way go further into observational experiment, you would say. But he also went further into Platonism, in that he took mathematics as being more a description of the real than appearance could ever be. Um, but even Aristotle was a student of Plato's, you see. So, when we talk about the founding of the scientific revolution in someone like Galileo, it's a synthesis of the Platonic or Pythagorean mathematical mysticism and the Aristotelian observational empiricism. The Aristotelian focus on description and classification, and the Platonic focus on mathematical explanation, mathematical understanding, and even further, Plato provided more than just a system of knowledge. Plato's philosophy was a spiritual practice that transformed you as a knower. It didn't just provide you with some ready-made knowledge that you are capable by some right of understanding. You have to develop the capacity to understand. Cropper has a big problem with this too, and to some extent I would want to democratize Plato, but I think democratizing Plato is only possible today when most people can read and write, when most people are literate and can think about what it means to be the citizen of a public or a republic. Plato had an understanding that in order for a republic to exist, it couldn't just be the philosopher king that had the understanding, but everyone in the city. And we are at least capable of educating everyone in the city to be as intelligent as Plato was. We have the technology for that. We don't have the material conditions entirely, because our economic system and our system of ethical relationship and exchange with one another is not democratic yet. It's privileged. It's privileged. It's based on the inheritance of power rather than the equal distribution, of presence to one another here and now, regardless of what the parent generation gave to their individual offspring. To the extent that we are members of a community, we are participants in a universe, which is something that is always making itself anew and will never be fully defined by the past. And so, what we really need is not Platonism any more than what we really need is Darwinism. What we need is a way of thinking and being with time and eternity that doesn't prematurely separate them. They certainly become separate in appearance, in time. Eternity and becoming, eternity and experience, these are differences that we mark, but we mark these differences. And so who is it that's marking them? Well, the who that marks the difference between eternity and time must be a God incarnate, an intelligence fully imbued with a natural reflection to itself, a natural image of itself. And I think we have the technology. The human species, the Earth, has the technology to make this apparent to every human being on the planet. We can each become as intelligent and as intuitive as Plato or any other, Jesus, Buddha. Or at least that's the challenge. Like, each one of us has to become capable of participating in the unfolding of the universe at a level equal to, a sage. That's what democracy would require. That's what a universal society would require. A social body capable of participating in the true nature of the cosmos. So So I think, as Teilhard suggested, what we need is, for the noosphere to emerge, that sense of global participation in a unified mind, as Teilhard suggested, would require more personalization, more individualization, so we become more ourselves, more fully aware of our nature as individual beings, and in that way begin to participate in a mind larger than ourselves. So I guess all of that is one long defense of idealism, which, to sum up, I mean, to say I'm an idealist would mean to say that I'm an anti-realist. I think ideas are present to us in reality in an even more intimate way than sensory appearances. Sensory appearances are always the atoms that we come to break up into parts after having intuitively integrated the idea that forms their structure. So atomism is a later reflection upon the continuous formation, the continuous realization and coming into being of an idea that we witness in the organic world. So, I think it's already an abstraction to talk about the sensory world as if it existed apart from the mind. So someone, like Hegel would say that the first proof of idealism is eating and defecation, and the ability of an organism to assimilate forms outside of itself and transform them into its own self. That is the idea, coming to know the other, coming to know it completely such that it becomes the organism. And there's this defecation too, which for the idealist is an important problem to deal with, right? Pollution is an important problem for the idealist to deal with. Extinction is an important problem for the idealist to deal with. But these are the problems we should be dealing with, not the materialist's problems, because the materialist problems always consist in figuring out how to explain away our illusion, our supposed illusion about the nature of reality. So the materialists are always taking this iconoclast stance of, oh, tradition is so stupid, why don't we just pay attention, to what we really want and what's right in front of us, and we'll just solve all our problems. But the idealist is saying, really, the tradition had a truth that we have forgotten, and that the nature of memory is what's finally constituting our sense of well-being and the nature of our surrounding habitat. And so if we want to change our behavior as earthlings, we have to reconceptualize the nature of our own selves and the nature of the nature which we suppose ourself exists in relation to. And idealism is a reflection upon all of those conditions, not as a consciousness separate from a cosmos or a mind separate from a body. Idealism isn't necessarily dualism. Idealism is just the claim that what we sense of the outward, external, corporeal world is only an external surface, and that the surface is a sort of visible trace of an underlying invisible force or set of forces, or relationship between forces or powers, and that what we witness as the formation and the becoming of individual forms are universal ideas that are invisible and that underlie those growing, eating, defecating, living creatures that we are and that we come into relation with, and that we are because we come into relation with. So idealism isn't a denial of relational constitution. It's not a denial of material conditions. It's just the awakening to your participation in that ongoing realization of soul and flesh, mind and body,